Disney Storybook Collection Advent Calendar, a festive countdown. 24
Wow, my buddy. Wow.
Let's see what's inside.
Oh my gosh.
Let's see what's inside.
Oh. It's got a string. That's exciting.
You gotta let go so we can open it. Here we go.
Whoa.
And you know what day it is? 1.
Because we say it is. It's technically day 2, but we need to catch up. So we're gonna do day 1. Thank you, Giant Calendar. What do you think, buddy? An advent calendar of books, a festive countdown with 24 books, Disney Storybook Collection.
Mickey's Christmas Carol.
Wow.
This will be fun.
It will be. I love the little movie. I remember growing up watching that.
This little movie scares Daddy.
Oh no, I love it. Wow.
It was Christmas Eve, and Ebenezer Scrooge was rushing through snowy London. Scrooge did not like Christmas, and he didn't believe in helping the poor. He barged past carolers and wouldn't even give them a penny to anyone. Even when Scrooge's nephew Fred stopped by the office shouting, "Merry Christmas, Uncle Scrooge!" Scrooge kicked him out. A while later, Scrooge's assistant, Bob Cratchit, stepped down from his stool to go home. "I suppose you'll be wanting tomorrow off," Scrooge barked. "But be here all the earlier the next day." "Thank you, Mr. Scrooge," cried Bob. "And Merry Christmas," he called as he ran out. "Bah, humbug," muttered Scrooge. Later that night, Scrooge locked up the office and went home. As he went to open his front door, Scrooge took a closer look at his door knocker. He gasped. On the door knocker was the face of his old business partner, Jacob Marley. The face began to move, then softly called, "Scrooge." Frightened, Scrooge raced inside, but soon enough, the ghost of his former partner appeared in front of him, chains circling his body. "Tonight you will be visited by 3 spirits," boomed Marley. "Listen to them, do what they say, or your chains will be even heavier than mine. Farewell, Ebenezer." Scrooge went to bed, but not long later he was awoken by a little figure in a top hat. "I am the ghost of Christmas past," he told Scrooge. "You must come with me." But Scrooge laughed. "Look how small you are. Go away." "Silence," ordered the spirit. "If men were measured by the kindness, you would be smaller than a grain of sand. We are going back to a time when Christmas was not humbug." The spirit commanded Scrooge, grabbed hold of his coattails, and remembering Marley's terrible warning, he held on. The windows flew open, and instantly they were soaring over rooftops and chimneys. The little spirit's umbrella kept them aloft. That's a lot of words to these, huh?
Mm-hmm.
Soon they landed outside a brightly lit house. Joyful Christmas music filled the air. Peering through the windows, Scrooge couldn't believe his eyes. "Why, it's Isabel!" he cried, suddenly remembering the girl he once loved. "But who is she dancing so merrily with?" "That was you, Scrooge," replied the spirit. "In the days when you, Sue, were kind and cheerful." Then the spirit whisked Scrooge away to another scene. Inside, Scrooge saw many years before sat in front of a table full of money. Isabel stood in front of him, and tears in her eyes. "Why is Isabel crying?" asked Scrooge. Then he remembered. He hadn't taken Isabel home. He had taken Isabel's home from her when she could not pay her bills and refused to marry her. That's pretty harsh.
It's hard.
I love this lady, but she can't pay her bills. Not for me.
He's very interested in her money, that's for sure.
Suddenly, Scrooge found himself back in bed. He thought it had been a dream. But then his thoughts turned to Isabel and how he had a chance of happiness with her, and he ruined it with his love of money. Scrooge put his head down and sobbed into his pillow. As he cried, Scrooge felt a heavy hand on his shoulder. He sat up, and facing the bed was a fierce-looking giant feasting. "I am the ghost of Christmas present," he boomed. "There's no time to lose." And with that, the spirit picked Scrooge up and put him in his pocket. And then they stepped pushed open the roof and stepped outside, as though from a doll's house. Scrooge peeked out of the giant's pocket. "I wonder where we're going," he said to himself. Pulling Scrooge from his pocket, the spirit tore a lamp post from the ground to use as a lantern. As he walked through the streets, soon they arrived at a tiny, run-down house. "What a dreadful little house!" Scrooge exclaimed. "Who could live in such a place? Perhaps a miserable beggar."
"Look closer, Scrooge, and tell me who you see,"
said the spirit. Scrooge pressed his face against the glass for a better look. "What? It's Bob Cratchit, my clerk," he said with surprise. "Does he live here?" The spirit scowled.
"Look at how he lives thanks to your generosity. Look at the food his family must eat on Christmas Eve, because it's all they can afford."
The hungry Cratchit family sat at the table, about to carve up the smallest goose Scrooge had ever seen. Scrooge watched as a boy named Tiny Tim hobbled into the room. Leaning on his little crutch, he gave thanks to Scrooge for the meal, and Scrooge felt ashamed. "Tell me, spirit, what's wrong with that kind lad?" asked Scrooge.
"Much, I'm afraid," the spirit said. "In these shadows remain unchanged. I see an empty chair where Tiny Tim once sat."
Suddenly the scene went dark, and Scrooge was alone, church bells tolling in the distance. Just then, swirling smoke engulfed Scrooge, growing thicker and thicker until he couldn't see anything around him. The smoke blew into his nose and he coughed. As the smoke lifted, Scrooge found himself standing in a graveyard. There were tombstones everywhere, covered by snow. Scrooge looked up to find out he was no longer alone. A horrible shadow, his face hidden in a cloak, stood silently before him. "Are you the ghost of Christmas future?" stammered Scrooge. "Tell me, what will happen to Tiny Tim?" The spirit just looked at Scrooge, then raised his arm to point to something in the distance. Scrooge looked to where the spirit was pointing and saw Bob Cratchit and his family gathered around a tombstone. Bob knelt down before the gravestone, tears rolling down his face, and gently laid Tiny Tim's crutch on top. "Oh no!" Scrooge cried. "Spirit, I did not want this to happen. Tell me you can change these events. Tell me they can be changed." Scrooge noticed two gravediggers finishing a fresh grave. "I've never seen no funeral like this," one of them said. "No mortals, no friends to bid him farewell." Scrooge peered into the grave and asked the spirit who it belonged to.
"Why, it's you, Ebenezer,"
the spirit laughed when his hood fell from his face. "No, I'll change!" cried Scrooge. The grave burst into flames and the spirit pushed him inside. "Let me out!" screamed Scrooge. "Let me!" Suddenly, a bell tolled, and as Scrooge opened his eyes, he cried with joy. He was back in his bedroom. "It's Christmas morning!" he exclaimed. He threw on his coat and hat and raced for the door. He ran out into the streets calling, "Merry Christmas!" to everyone he met. He gave two men a bag of coins, who stood there speechless, wondering what had changed in the grumpy old Scrooge. Scrooge even stopped his nephew when he saw him approaching a wagon. Fred was so surprised by his uncle's cheerfulness that he almost fell off his carriage. Waving goodbye to his nephew, Scrooge continued on his way to Bob Cratchit's house. Rat, rat! Scrooge knocked on the employee's door. Bob opened the door, and his face fell when he saw who it was. "Why, Mr. Scrooge, Merry Christmas. Won't you come in?" he said. Scrooge stomped inside and dropped a heavy sack on the floor. Scrooge then broke into a massive smile and told Bob he was getting a pay raise, and he'd brought food and toys for his whole family. Bob Cratchit couldn't believe it. Oh, thank you, Mr. Scrooge. Merry Christmas, Bob, Scrooge said, and the whole family danced with joy. And it was a Christmas miracle. "And God bless us, everyone," said Tiny Tim. Boop. That was Mickey's Christmas Carol.
Great job,
That was
my
fun.
baby. That was a great book. Yay! Yay! You love books. Yes, you do. That was day one.
Boop.
Ma.